Πριν να μιλήσω, θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω τους οργανητές για την ευκαιρία που μου δίνουν να παρουσιάσω τις ιδέες μου. Και δεύτερον, θα ήθελα να ζητήσω συγγνώμη από το ακροατήριο που δεν θα μιλήσω στα ελληνικά. Ό,τι έχω σκεφτεί, ό,τι έχω γράψει για την αρχαία ναυπηγική, το έχω κάνει στα αγγλικά και πάντα γράφω το κείμενό μου στα αγγλικά. Δεν υπήρξε χρόνο να δώσω το κείμενο για μια καλή μετάφραση από Έλληνα και δεν θα ήθελα να παρουσιάσω τα δικά μου γραφτά pidgin ελληνικά. The history of early Aegean wooden watercraft is written overwhelmingly by proxy. There are no shipwrecks of documented Aegean origin until the 7th century BC, and once the series begins, the vessels are exclusively merchantmen, at a time when galleys played an important role. This bias in the physical evidence is to the extent complete that remains of galleys have been identified only twice among the hundreds of excavated wrecks. In the Mediterranean, a wreck site is generally an amphora mound covering more or less well-conserved remains of a merchantman. A succession across time of excavated, well-documented wrecks allows staking out the major moments in the architectural history of the merchantman, although by referring to single instances. This amounts to a fraction of early Aegean shipbuilding. It passes in silence over the prehistoric antecedents. It ignores craft that are not merchantmen. The proxy for writing of the history of early Aegean watercraft is provided by imagery. The advantages and disadvantages are numerous. A wreck is a specific individual constructed physically, used, repaired, lost with a cargo at sea. A single datum point on a continuum. An image is a distillation of the characteristic traits of a certain type of watercraft, reduced in detail until it fits the support. It is generally part of a cluster of representations spread out along the continuum. Ideally, the study of imagery would provide the typological framework, the study of wrecks, the separate instances. However, images rarely depict merchantmen, wrecks are never galleys, small craft are largely ignored. A narrative must be pieced together from very uneven evidence, leaving many gaps, generating many questions, some of which may be answered tentatively by reference to ethnographic data, rarely to chronologically contemporary data from the Eastern Mediterranean. There are over 370 individual images of watercraft dating to the Greek Bronze Age. Models, incisions and paintings on vases, wall paintings, engravings on seal stones. If pre-Bronze Age representations are added, particularly the final Neolithic pictographs from Strophilas on Andros, the total rises to well over 420. Out of the lower total, let's just say out of 370, more than 200 can be securely assigned to 8 well-defined types. 6 types narrate the evolution of shipbuilding in the prehistoric Aegean. The 7th is created by the talismanic ship images, the 8th by a small number of cult craft. The 6 main types are represented by anywhere between 10 to 52 individuals each, so that any interpretive statement is founded on a cluster of representations, not on a single or a few instances. Each type is clearly defined in time, illustrating chronological stages in the history of Aegean Bronze Age shipbuilding. This at first glance ideal situation obscures the possible, even probable existence of concurrent alternative types that simply did not make it into the pictorial record, which for much of the Bronze Age was palace-driven. Type 1 provides an illustration. The dominant early Bronze watercraft, early Bronze II watercraft, is the one illustrated on a series of early Cycladic II frying pans from the Kalendriani cemetery on Syros. It also appears on a shard from Boeotian Orchomenos, on two marble slabs from Korfi Taroniou on Naxos, and in the form of a model from Palekastro in Crete. The stern rises to a substantial height, the hull is long, the bow has a pronounced projection beyond the stem post, the many short strokes indicate that propulsion is by paddling. These are longboats. Toward the end of the early Bronze Age, the longboats are replaced in the pictorial record by the first ships, the pre-palatial Minoan Type II. The high stern, the low bow with projection and vertical stem post confirm their roots in the longboat. But the mast and rigging and the oars indicate that the hull is substantially wider on the beam, and the number of oars, averaging out at 5, are congruent with a much shorter length overall. A sail is never shown, but the seal from Platanos depicts a lowered boom and yard, so it is safe to assume that this type of sail was in general use at the time. Here is the lowered boom and yard. This is a scratch on the ivory seal. Note steering oar and 3 steering oars. The advantages over the longboat are manifest. Greater cargo carrying capacity, even with a shorter hull length, more efficient modes of propulsion, vastly reduced crew requirements. It has been argued that only a select few early Cycladic II sites had the manpower, up to 40 and more paddlers, sufficient to crew a longboat. Any seaside village on Crete could man a Type II vessel. The Type II ship remained the workhorse of the Minoan economy well into the Protopalatial period. The first Minoan palaces see the introduction of a new hull shape, Type III, the attenuated crescent shape with both extremities rising above the gunwale line. The stern is distinguished in the imagery from the bow by being bifurcated. The bow carries a bird effigy. Propulsion is by square sail with yard and boom, and or by oar. The earliest examples attain a length overall barely superior to that of the Type II craft, but quickly the size increases. Before the destruction of the old palaces, ships of this type have reached a length of close to 30 meters, as illustrated by the ship procession on the matte-painted pithos from Colonna on Aegean. Again, there is a suggestion of other hull shapes, but these are too isolated to constitute types. Protopalatial Crete ends in a series of destructions, but there's no hiatus before the palaces are reconstructed. The Neopalatial period is characterized by a new hull shape, Type IV, an attenuated crescent shape with bow and stern rising to more or less equal height, the stern at a somewhat sharper angle. Both ends are tapered to a point. A bird effigy or a bowsprit with a bird is attached to the stem post. Propulsion is by sail and or by oar. The miniature wall painting from the West House at Akrotiiri depicts a ritual use involving paddles. The sail is of the usual type, a square sail with yard and boom. Sizes vary from small vessels with 5 oars per side, in other words, no larger than a Type 2 craft, to very large ships with up to 20 rowers per side. The Type 7 talismanic ships are shorthand notations. What we see is the bow, in other words here, and this is the Ikrion here. And we also see the same type of ship on the Statatos collection seal of the Type 4 design, which also appears among the Type 8 cult boats. A scatter of post-Neopalatial representations indicate that Type 4 was in use down to the destructions of 1200 BC, which put an end to the world of the palaces. That's this one here. The Mycenaeans invented a new type, the galley. The earliest depiction dates from late Helladic 3b, but it would be foolhardy to claim that it is the first. The silhouette depicts a long vessel with swiftly rising stern and a bow with a horizontal projection at the waterline and a vertical stem post crowned by a bird's head. Propulsion is primarily by up to 25 rowers per side, but also by sail. A new type of sail is introduced, the loose-footed braille type. That is to say, it's a sail without a lower boom. It only has a yard. But it does not entirely replace the square sail with the yard and boom of types 2, 3, and 4. The galley clearly replaces the Minoan oared sailing ship as far as the Mycenaeans are concerned. 2 different types of galleys are developed. One, Type 5, a wider-beamed, deeper-hulled vessel with a deck, suitable both for trading and for war at sea. The other, Type 6, a sleek-hulled, undecked ship, obviously built for speed. The typological classification creates a chronological framework, the first element of a historical narrative. The resulting image is transparent. The first well-documented seagoing vessel in the Aegean Bronze Age are the Cycladic longboats, Type 1, which are replaced by the first Minoan ships, Type 2, which in turn are replaced by Protopalatial vessels, Type 3, which are replaced by the Neopalatial craft, Type 4, which are replaced by the 2 Mycenaean galley designs, Types 5 and 6. The image is much too transparent. There are multiple factors at work in creating this simplistic succession of shapes. Early Cycladic II art is representational at a time when early Helladic and early Minoan are not. The 3 Minoan types reflect, on the one hand, a period of Minoan dominance in the Aegean, on the other, the dominance of a single kind of support. All members of Type 2 are depicted on seal stones, as are all members of Type 3 except those on the colonna pithos. Almost all Type 4 representations are on seal stones, except mainly those of the Akrotiiri miniature wall painting. There is a risk of a leveling, both through the small size of the support and through workshop tendencies to create icons rather than individual images. It is likely that there existed other hull shapes, either not documented in the corpus of ship images, or so rarely as not to warrant a type designation. It thus becomes necessary to double back and develop a second narrative, one based on the two axes of evolution that can be discerned beyond the clusters of the typology. The first axis concerns the conceptual. It has three major moments: the dugout-based craft, the plank-built oared sailing vessel, the oared galley. Each moment constitutes a reconceiving of the idea of the watercraft. These moments do not involve only issues of hull design, but also modes of propulsion: paddles, oar, sail, and hybridizations, the sailing vessel being rowed, the galley under sail. The second axis concerns the technological. It comprises three areas: one, assembly technique, laced, stitched; intermediary hybrid, that is to say a mix of laced, stitched and the following mortise and tenon. Two, longitudinal or dorsal hull member. Is it a dugout core, a so-called hog, or a T-hog, or a keel? Three, structural complexity. Rowers on a single level, on two levels, on three levels. In the last case, the trieres, it also involves the outrigger. Before it is claimed that these axes attempt to attain a level of analytical complexity well beyond the capacity of the corpus of images to respond to such inquiries, two observations may be made. When one knows what one is looking for, and ethnography and shipwreck archaeology are the most evident mentors, one does find indications. And indications is all one will ever find, given that images, not even so detailed, large-scale representations as the big ships on the acroaterium miniature wall painting, are never blueprints. The following method will be applied. The cluster population of each type will be examined for structural details, and these will then be placed on the conceptual and technological axes. In the end, it will be argued that the analysis of the ship images of Greek prehistory argue in favor of three major conceptual turning points, moments when the building of watercraft was radically changed. The argument could be extended to include a socioeconomic component, the impact of these changes on the boat-building societies, but that must remain outside the present scope. As noted above, the substantial length overall and the many short strokes above and below the hull argue for a longboat design when we approach the Cycladic longboats. The absence of a mast and of members of the cluster depicted with long strokes, which would suggest oars, also argue in this direction. The bow with projection and stem post suggests that these craft are several stages ahead of a simple dugout. The immediate successor design, the Minoan Type II ship, which is clearly indebted to the longboat, renders it likely that the Cycladic vessels constitute the final stage in longboat architecture. The basic dugout, 125, an inherently unstable craft, can have its stability improved in several ways. One, through the addition of a flotational device, for example, a small diameter tree trunk to each side, that's 126. Through the lashing together of two or more dugouts, 127. 3, through assembling two dugouts without the internal divider, 128. 4, through expansion, the dugout is split longitudinally and a plank is inserted in the middle. Further inserted planks will gradually widen the vessel to create a barge or raft-like craft. That's 129. 5, through extension, a plank is attached to the edge of the dugout on both sides, that is, increasing its freeboard. 130. and 6 through expansion and extension. In other words, 4 and 4 and 5. Well, 129 and 130. The alternative, 5, constitutes the route to more complex craft, since more than one plank can be added, and or the dugout core can be shaved down to constitute the dorsal element to which a series of strakes are attached, constituting the first plank-built vessel. The stem post at the bow of the Cycladic longboat suggests that these are extended dugouts, that at least one plank has been attached to the gunwale. One of the Calandriani frying pans depicts 2 vessels, each with a zigzag along the hull that has been interpreted as stitching or lacing. The first Minoan vessels are derived from the longboat, but conceptually they constitute a leap forward. Every member of the cluster is depicted with a mast, and 10 of 22 are shown with 4, 5, or 6 oars. Both modes of propulsion require a much wider beam than a paddled vessel. The hull is substantially shorter, but the raised stern and the bow with projection and post reproduce the silhouette of the longboat. This is particularly visible on the chronologically earliest members of the cluster. Keeping in mind that no evidence external to the seal images exists, a hypothetical interpretation of the Type 2 hull would propose, 1, that the dorsal element, the longitudinal element, is constituted by a shaved-down dugout, visible, as it were, in the bow projection. 2, that several strakes are attached, edge-joined, to this dugout core, shaping the transverse section of the hull. And 3, that these strakes increase the beam to an extent greater than that possible if starting from an intact dugout. The Minoan Type 2 vessel is the first ship. It is an oared sailing ship. The sail constitutes its primary mode of propulsion, but the presence of 8 to 12 rowers, that is, of the necessary benches, indicate that it is not a merchantman on the definition of the latter preferred by the present speaker. A merchantman is a cargo vessel relying solely on sail for propulsion, carrying at best, as was the case with the 4th century Kyrenia ship, a few, in the Kyrenia case, 4 sweeps, very long oars used only for maneuvering. The Type 2 vessel was a very successful design, remaining in use, or at least depicted by seal cutters, well into protopalatial times. But it could be improved upon. The most obvious improvement is achieved by moving away from the dugout core, by adopting as a central dorsal element the hog. A hog is a plank thicker than the strakes that make up the shell of the hull. The hog allows the shipwright greater freedom in shaping the longitudinal lines of the vessel. By propping up the extremities and weighing down the center, rocker results. Rocker is the shape like this of a hull, the lengthwise shape. Limited rocker can be attained with a dugout core, but requires sculpting the trunk. With rocker, the stem post, scarfed at an angle to the dorsal element, is no longer necessary. The strakes taper toward the extremities. The attenuated crescent-shaped hull results. The change from dugout core to hog cannot be proven by reference to the pictorial record. Consequently, it is not possible to determine whether the dorsal element was a simple flat hog, or whether at some point a T-hog was introduced. That is a central element that if you show it cut through, it has this shape here. It is the beginning of a keel. The T-hog, because of the narrow protruding part, the upright of the T, creates a primitive keel effect, improving the ship's ability to grip the water and sail a truer course, closer to the steered course, lessening leeway. A second advantage of the hog, as opposed to the dugout core, is evident. Whereas Type 2 ships do not appear to have been longer than 8 to 10 meters, Type 3 vessels range closer to 15 meters. The ships on the Pythos from Colonna form the exception. Although there are no direct means available to determine their length overall, they are clearly related to the large ships on the acroaterium miniature wall painting, which are over 30 meters long. The sheer size of the Terran ships, duplicated by the 20 to 30 meters length of those Type 4 seal images that depict oars, hint at further advances in ship architecture. Although concrete evidence is absent, it is tempting to suggest that the difference between Type 3 and 4, two very similar hull shapes, is to be sought in a move from hog to keel, or at least a proto-keel. The difference lies in the width to depth ratio. On a hog, since it is a thicker plank, width is greater than the thickness or its depth into the water, while on a keel, the depth is greater than the thickness. The hog is a lying rectangle, the keel a standing one.
Can you repeat the last part again?
Well, the difference between a keel, between a hog and a keel, the hog is placed like this in the hull, and then come the strakes. The keel is placed like this, and the strakes extend from the keel. Yeah. The presence of a keel in ships of Type 4 is not merely a guess. A fragment of a bronze model from the temple of Aegean on Chios, and dating to somewhat later than the acroaterium ships, has a depression running down the center. Among the talismanic ship seals, there are several with a separate line cut along the lowest edge of the hull. Some of these images are even cut in a three-dimensional manner, in that the cut of the hull is deepest at the gunwale, where the ship is widest, and shallowest at the bottom of the hull, which is emphasized by the separate line. So this is the gunwale, this is here, and the cut is, by the seal cutter, is made in such a manner that it becomes shallower as you come closer to the keel, and then there is an extra line cut to show where the keel was, or so I believe. Finally, a terracotta model fragment from Mycenae, dating to late Atlantic 3C, which of course is substantially later, exhibits a thickening down the center line. The Type 4 ship continues in use down to the end of late Atlantic 3B, that is around 1200 BC. But the cutting edge of ship design has shifted some 150 to 200 years earlier, when a Mycenaean shipwright did not prop up the bow end of the dorsal element into a rising extremity, but instead just raised it to waterline level and scarfed a stem post into it a short distance back from its end. Several depictions of this new Mycenaean type of ship are rendered in the so-called X-ray technique, emphasizing the rooms of the rowers. Each room seats one rower. This Mycenaean ship was the first galley, probably of type 6, designed to be propelled primarily by rowers and relegating the sail to secondary propulsive mode. The effects are several. One, the extension of the dorsal element, now most probably a proto-keel beyond the stem post, created a buoyancy effect, allowing rowers to be seated into the eyes of the hull, into the very bow. Larger crews, up to 25 rowers per side, became possible. The pentekonteros appears. Two, the large crew led to greater speed under oars compared to a Type 4 ship, with the bow projection protecting the hull in a forced beaching. Three, while a Type 4 ship sailed quite handsomely with a skeleton crew of sail handlers, allowing the hull below and on the benches to be given over to goods, to cargo, the galley required a full crew at all times. A second design, Type 5, was required to compensate for the loss in cargo capacity by providing it with a deck, a military function as fighting platform, enhanced the multifunctionality of the vessel. And I add that this is not a ram. Ramming does not enter into warfare at sea until much later, towards the end of the Archaic period. 4, although the warrior rower is not a Mycenaean invention, since they appear on a Middle Helladic shard from Colonna, and on the late Cycladic I acroaterior miniature wall painting, the galley design systematized their use. In other words, I argue that the 25 or the 50 rowers on a ship like this are not just rowers, but they're also soldiers. Images of watercraft do not provide evidence for assembly technique, with the possible exception of the Cycladic frying pan with a zigzag line along the hull. The study of remains from archaic and classical wrecks, that is, merchantmen, reveal a gradual replacement of lacing by mortise and tenon joinery, the process being completed by the later 6th century. On the basis of this, some scholars project the use of lacing backward into prehistory, where it joins up with the tentative interpretation for the Cycladic longboats. The craft constructed by Odysseus, when he finally is allowed to leave the island of Calypso, is taken as further evidence for the exclusive use of lacing, stitching, in the geometric period, when all vessels depicted in vase painting or described in the Homeric poems are galleys. Mortise and tenon joinery is, on this account, introduced in galley construction in the Aegean with the trieris in the second half of the 6th century BC. That reconstruction chooses to ignore the use of a variety of mortise and tenon techniques in Egypt, and the fact that the elements of the hull salvaged from the Uluburun wreck indicate that the vessel was assembled with mortises and tenons. The questions become, 1, did Aegean Bronze Age shipwrights construct watercraft using lacing exclusively, while those of Egypt and the Levant were conversant with the mortise and tenon technique? 2, is Odysseus' craft most likely a small vessel, given the amount of wood used, the time taken, and the fact that the builder was alone, relevant to geometric galley construction in general? 3, are data from archaic merchantmen relevant to earlier and contemporary galleys? 4, is not the rigidity and the decreased maintenance characteristic of mortise and tenon joined hulls a trait most desirable in a galley, regardless of when one chooses to claim that ramming was introduced? Answers cannot be given here. Only an admonition not to exclude an early Aegean use of mortise and tenon joinery, chronologically concurrent with the Uluburun wreck, and a stress on the suitability of mortise and tenon joinery for the use to which galleys were put. And finally, a note that the so-called Dark Ages were not as black as once believed. The use of chariots continued down to the late geometric period, and the galley design was further refined. To conclude, it is necessary to double back again and undertake a third, much shorter narrative. Having reviewed the evidence for the 6 main ship types of the Greek Bronze Age and examined the scattered hints of construction technique, it is possible to identify the major conceptual moments in the history of Aegean shipbuilding. These conceptual moments can also be called turning points. They pinpoint the moment in time when the construction of watercraft undertake a drastic change of course, despite the conservative nature of the business. The concept changes. 3 such moments are identified. The first is the moment when the dugout is extended. In the Aegean, this took place sometime well before the Bronze Age and is not visible in the available evidence. The Cycladic longboats represent the last link in the extended dugout chain. And putting 4000 BC is a wild guess on my part. The second is the moment when the extended dugout becomes the first plank-built ship. Type 2 represents this moment, roughly datable to somewhere between 2300 and 2100 BC in early Minoan 3. Types 3 and 4 constitute technological refinements. The third is the moment the Mycenaean shipwright introduces the galley. Compared to a Type 4 ship, of which it is a direct descendant, the galley is a revolutionary concept because it inverts the basic conception of the hull. Previously, ships were built as hollow containers onto and into which modes of propulsion were grafted. You put a mast, you put in benches for your rowers. The galley is conceived around the power unit, the rowers. The stern is much shorter than on a Type 4 vessel. The bow is likewise curtailed, and the projection allows seating rowers further into the bow. In other words, you construct your hull around the power unit and only make it large enough for the power unit. The evidence suggests that this change took place in late Helladic 3b, that is around 1350 BC. But it may have occurred in 3A2, that's about 1400, or even in 3A1, 1430 or so. All further galleys, even the Hellenistic behemoths, hark back to this conceptual revolution. The Trieris, for example, which is the perfect illustration of a hull built around the power unit, is, from a ship architectural point of view, merely a technological issue. How to seat the rowers on 3 levels and enable them to work the oars in unison. The outrigger for the topmost level is developed, at least for the Greek Trieris. Where the Trieris bends the trajectory of ship design is in the fact that it introduces the monofunctional warship. The Trieris is built for ramming, and it thereby creates the warship merchantman crossroad. It is no coincidence that the number of shipwrecks, all merchantmen, increases fairly suddenly around 550 BC. That is, around the time that the Trieris is introduced into the polis navies. Previously, galleys also carried cargo. 3 narratives. The first is founded on typological classification. It is within the limits of the individual scholar objective, or objective. It provides the basis for writing a history of ship design in the Greek Bronze Age. The second is the result of scattered observations gathered from the evidence, enriched with putative comparanda from ethnography and other sources. It is hypothetical. The third is an attempt to take several steps back and summarize the observations made in narratives 1 and 2, to identify the major concepts, in short, to create the overall framework for a study of early shipbuilding in the Aegean. Whoops. Well, αυτά. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ τον κύριο Βέντε. Έχουμε 10 λεπτά περίπου για ερωτήσεις στη συζήτηση. Ποιος θα ήθελε να ξεκινήσει? Ίσως και κάποιες διευκρινήσεις στα ελληνικά για όσους είχαν δυσκολία. Νομίζω θα μπορούσε να γίνει. Οι ερωτήσεις στα ελληνικά μπορούν να είναι, νομίζω θα είναι και. Κύριε Δαριανίδη.
In this context of classification, it's 6-7 types of typology of boats. Where you put the hypothesis of Papi boats, of the experiment of Papirella and this approach?
I cannot see how a papyrus boat can create an immediate wooden successor. So I concentrate on watercraft built in wood. I also believe that to get to a ship, you have to start from a dugout and not from a raft. So I exclude various forms of rafts, even those rafts that tend to get a bit of a hull shape. I don't deny papyrus crafts. We saw the Tiryns, gold ring from Tiryns, for example. I can show other examples of boats that definitely are made from papyrus. But for a history of Aegean Bronze Age shipbuilding, I don't see an influence from papyrus craft. The problem is, of course, that most of the images are this big. And you have to look at them really under a microscope to get the details. We simply don't have enough very large images that allow us to say a lot of things. That's really the main problem.
And another question. I saw that you proposed that the Mycenaean shipwrights introduced galleys. So how you call the long ships before the Mycenaeans? I mean, you don't think that galleys were even before the Mycenaeans? And what is the main point of differences?
Well, first of all, I see a difference between, on the one hand, the long boats propelled by paddles. They're simply not wide enough to be rowed. Then we have the Minoan type, which is a sailing vessel, which is also propelled with by oars. But the emphasis is on sailing. And for me, the Mycenaean shipwrights turns that upside down and puts the emphasis on rowing. That's the point for me when the galley begins. I know that some scholars have claimed that the acroatήριοι ships, for example, are galleys. I don't agree with that. Because no, I have to exclude them from, because a galley for me is a long, narrow ship propelled by oars. A frying pan boat is a long, narrow vessel, but propelled by paddles. For me, okay, I'm not a ship designer. I've done a bit of sailing. I might be approaching this from a completely wrong angle. But for me, it's a huge difference between...
You don't make any distinction between the beam of the boats and the ratio between the beam and the length.
I stress the width of the boat because it has to be wide enough if you're going to row the boat. But I don't think it's relevant to say, okay, a cyclic longboat has, say, a beam, a ratio of 1 to 10, and a galley has a ratio of 1 to 10, because they're not propelled in the same manner.
Do you know what type of wood did they use at that time? Between type 1 and type A, was there any evolution concerning the wood that they used, the wood that they used for the vessels? Do you know anything about it, and if there was any evolution?
The problem concerning wood in the Bronze Age is that we have none. We have, there's a little bit of wood, or almost none. There's a little bit of wood from the Cape Caledonia wreck, which dates to around 1200. There's a little bit more wood from the Uluburun wreck, where I think part of it, the keel at least was oak for Uluburun, I think. Point Iria has a few pieces of wood, but we don't have a... You see, we don't really have any Bronze Age wrecks that are definitely Aegean. Cape Caledonia, Uluburun can be whatever they are. There was a Mycenaean merchant on Uluburun, but it doesn't mean that the ship was Mycenaean. Cape Iria came from Cyprus, probably. Where did it come from originally? There was an interesting presentation at a recent symposium a couple of years ago, a study of wood from wrecks, where we actually have the wrecks. In other words, basically the 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd centuries and onwards. And every wood that had been used for building these ships that had been excavated in Israel, in Turkey, and in Greece, and I think even over in Italy, and even France, all came from Turkey, according to the results. There they showed there was a certain, not so much an evolution, but a specialization. You use certain types of wood for certain things. So to build a hull, you're going to be using maybe 4 or 5 different woods. But for the Bronze Age, all that is missing. That's, again, one of our big problems, which is why we're working from images and not from wrecks. Personally, I don't think we're ever going to find a very well-conserved Bronze Age wreck. And one won't be enough. Come back when, we have 20 wrecks or something like that. Because every wreck is an individual. And it only tells something about itself, not about what was being done generally. Well, there have been some experiments made with a square-sailed ship, so that there are some data on how close into the wind you can go. What it particularly depends on is the shape of the hull and the hull's ability to grip the water. The earlier Minoan ships, for example, would probably not be able to sail very hard into the wind because they probably didn't have a keel, so they would create enormous leeway. By the time we get to the acroatírio ships, well, there are some scholars who have approached them through being ship designers themselves and have considered the acroatírio ships to be highly developed, very rapid sailing ships capable of sailing quite close into the wind. But that has never been actually tried. The Kyrenia, I can't remember how many degrees off the wind it could sail, but there's a start. That's the only piece of evidence that we really have. There has been done some tests using a square sail on a boat hardly larger than a sailing boat in England, but that's not gonna. That's going to give us some ideas, but not. Personally, I'm very optimistic. I would like to believe that they could sail hard into the wind, fairly hard into the wind, but it's not something that I can prove. Like so many other things that I would like to be able to say something about, but I can't prove it.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a very enjoyable presentation. I just wanted to ask a question concerning function of the ships we have been talking about. Because we haven't discussed anything about whether they are warships or they are merchant ships, and the role of the function of the ship in the form of the hull and the way it's propelled. Because it seems that the role of the ship will be quite important in determining its mode of propulsion and its hull form. You haven't said anything about that. Could you say something now?
Yes, I might be a minority of one out in the desert, but I do not believe that the warship, that is to say a ship built solely for use in war, which for the ancient Greeks was ramming. I don't believe that that type of ship appears before about 550 BC. I don't buy the early, the Triers that is dated to around 700. I don't believe that existed. I think that Thucydides has been misused and abused in trying to prove the existence of an early Triers. So for me, the whole question of a single function for a hull only comes up when you have the Triers, because at the same time, you have much greater number of shipwrecks, of course, all merchantmen. The fact that the Triers as a galley is no longer has a cargo capacity, and I exclude the fact that you can convert a Triers to carry horses, but that's a secondary use, which quite thoroughly modifies the ship. For me, this absence of a cargo capacity makes it necessary to compensate through merchantmen. For me, the earlier galleys, archaic, geometric, and Bronze Age, were multifunctional. They could carry cargo as well. I think that the Mycenaeans did probably a lot of their trading in galleys, because they went into areas just like the later Greeks. I mean, the whole colonization of the ancient Greeks, when we have any information on the kind of ship that the colonists were sent to Italy or the Cyrenaica, it's always a galley. I think that the galley has been underestimated. It hasn't played the role in the writing of history that it should have, because we simply don't have all the evidence. I think the galley had a lot more uses than what we have recognized. Having said that, I think that the Mycenaean galley, the first one, built around the power unit, proved too limiting. So they built another type that was wider and deeper to give it more cargo capacity. And of course, we know from the Odyssey, for example, that they stowed cargo underneath the benches. And we have other evidence for galleys being used to transport cargo. You're not able to transport as much, but then again, if somebody comes up in another ship and is not friendly, you have your 20 or 50 rowers there to defend your ship. And I think that's the interest in the galley for much of the Iron Age and the Archaic period. The fact that it went where it wanted to, and if there was going to be a fight, it was there to fight. It had the possibility of fighting.
Thanks. I think so. It's clear that the triaris is actually the first point in which we have a single function.
For me, I don't expect everybody to agree with me, particularly with the question of ramming. I place ramming as a specific war technique fairly late. For example, Herodotus tells us about the Battle of Alalia. I don't think that the Phocaean pentakonteroi that were being used were built for ramming, and that's why the battle ended like it did. They lost many ships, and those that they still had were badly damaged because they were not designed for it. Yeah.
So they tried for ramming, but they were
Yeah.
successful.
Exactly. I think that's a point where ramming doesn't start with the triaris. They don't build a ship like the triaris and say, what are we going to use it for? They have already been doing some ramming, and they need to improve the ramming capacity. And I think Dick Steffi's analysis of the athlete ram is very instructive in telling us how the force of striking another ship have to be channeled through the hull. And the triaris is, I think, the first hull that is really thought, where they seriously thought about retaining structural integrity after a ramming attack, and where they actually built the ship around this idea. Make it like a torpedo, put as many rowers as possible in it, and use it for ramming. Which is why the Athenians were really the only ones who truly understood the use of the triaris. And they practiced. Most other Greek city-states would use the triaris as a floating battle platform.
That's not exclude the possibility that triaris were before ramming. So perhaps Herodotus was right about the origin of the first triaris in Corinth. And then there is this Phoenician triaris.
Well, my problem with the way that Thucydides has been used is that there is that one passage, is it 1:13:1 or something like that, where he says, it is said that the Corinthians were the first to construct ships in the modern manner. We don't know what he means with the modern manner, but it could mean building triaris. Secondly, it is said that the second statement is about Amenoclus and the 4 ships for the Samians, and the third is about the sea battle between the Corinthians and the Kerkyraeans. Each of these statements are preceded by it is said, it appears, or we believe. And then in 1:14, he says, the triaris did not appear in Polish navies until shortly before the Persian Wars. That's why I don't accept a trieris that was invented, say, 700 or 650, and then was not used for 100 years, and hardly ever built, apparently, and then it starts to come in. I think that the... Sure, if we, I mean, we don't even know if there's 170 rower trieris in the beginning. No. Yeah. I think that whole early trieris thing is a very cloudy issue. And it has been overstated or too confidently stated by much of the literature.
Απλώς θα ήθελα, μου επιτρέπετε, να συμπληρώσω στην ερώτηση που έγινε για το τι ξύλα, ποια ξύλα χρησιμοποιούσαν. Να πω ότι στην αρχαιότητα τα είδη ξύλων που χρησιμοποιούσαν στην ξυλοναυπηγική, με βάση τα δεδομένα τα δικά μου σαν ειδικός πάνω στο ξύλο, ήταν αυτά που κατά κάποιο τρόπο υπάρχουν, αλλά σε μικρή ποσότητα και σήμερα. Αυτά δεν ήταν το αυτοφιές οριζοντιόκλαδο κυπαρίσι, το αυτοφιές όμως που υπήρχε και υπάρχει σε ελάχιστες ποσότητες ακόμα στην Κρήτη, στα σπαθιά της Κρήτης, στη Σάμο και σε κάποια άλλα νησιά. Επίσης το πεύκο, η Χαλέπιος πέφτει, αυτή που είναι κοντά στη θάλασσα και που αναγεννάται μόνη της κάθε φορά που θα έλεγα βάζουμε φωτιά, διότι πηγαίνει για να την κάνουμε οικόπεδα. Η τραχεία πέφτει, που και αυτή ήταν πολύ ωραίο ξύλο για ξυλοναυπηγική, και βέβαια και η Ιδρύς, η οποία την εποχή εκείνη, όσο πιο πίσω πάμε, υπήρχε σε τεράστια δάση στην Ελλάδα, αλλά στην πορεία καταστράφηκαν για τους γνωστούς λόγους. Θα έλεγα ακόμα και η αγριελιά ήταν ένα είδος ξύλου που σε κάποια φάση χρησιμοποιήθηκε σε διάφορα τμήματα του σκελετού των σκαφών.
Σας ευχαριστώ για την παρατήρησή σας. Να ευχαριστήσουμε τον κύριο Βέντε. Καταλαβαίνω ότι υπάρχει κάποιο κείμενο το οποίο καλό θα ήταν να δημοσιοποιηθεί στους συμμετέχοντες. Ο κ. Καρύδης φαντάζομαι θα φροντίσει γι' αυτό. Να ευχαριστήσω βεβαίως συνολικά τους ομιλητές σήμερα. Νομίζω είχαμε μια πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα συνεδρία. Το πρόγραμμα